Margaret had always been a woman of few words, but of decisive actions. At 62 years old, she had built a life that many would consider enviable, not through ostentation, but through the silent solidity that characterized each brick of her existence. A widow for 8 years, Margaret learned early that in the business world, there's no room for sentimentalism. And it was exactly this calculated hardness that transformed her from a simple secretary into one of the most respected property owners in the Connecticut region. Her only daughter, Elizabeth, had always been the center of her universe, the reason why Margaret woke before dawn to review contracts and spent entire nights calculating investments. Everything Margaret built, each property acquired, each deal closed, had a single purpose: to ensure that Elizabeth would never go through the difficulties she herself faced when young. But fate has a peculiar sense of humor, and when Elizabeth brought home a young man named Derek Mitchell, Margaret felt for the first time in decades that tightness in her stomach she used to feel when something wasn't right. Derek was handsome, there was no denying it. Tall, with those blue eyes that seemed to promise sincerity, he had the kind of superficial charm that Margaret had learned to distrust over the years. But Elizabeth was in love, completely blind to the glow of young passion, and Margaret, despite all her reservations, didn't have the heart to break her daughter's heart even before the wedding happened. The wedding was discreet, as Elizabeth wished, an intimate ceremony in the garden of Margaret's main property, that Victorian mansion she had bought at a judicial auction 15 years ago and restored with her own savings. It was on that day, watching Derek smile at the guests with that excessive confidence, that Margaret made a silent decision. She would keep her eyes wide open. The first months were calm, almost idyllic on the surface. Derek got a job at a marketing company, something he described with great enthusiasm, but that seemed to yield little in terms of actual financial results. Elizabeth continued working as a graphic designer, a job she loved but that also didn't bring great income. It was then that Margaret, moved by that maternal love that sometimes makes us commit the most painful mistakes, made the offer that would change everything. The young couple could live in the guest house on her property, a charming and completely furnished building located in the back of the main lot. It was a house that Margaret normally rented for considerable amounts, but that she now offered free of charge to her daughter and son-in-law. Derek accepted with a smile that Margaret found too quick, too enthusiastic, without that genuine gratitude one would expect from someone receiving such a generous gift. But Elizabeth was radiant, and Margaret swallowed her concerns once again. The first signs of trouble began subtly, like weeds that appear discreetly in a well-kept garden before taking over everything. Derek began making comments about the house's decoration, suggesting changes that Margaret should make in her own main property. During Sunday dinners, which Margaret insisted on maintaining as a family tradition, Derek began to dominate conversations, talking incessantly about his grandiose plans, his brilliant ideas, his projects that would definitely take off soon. Margaret noticed how Elizabeth was becoming increasingly quiet on these occasions, as if she were being gradually erased by her husband's overwhelming presence. But what really bothered Margaret was the way Derek began treating the employees who took care of the property. Thomas, the gardener who had worked for Margaret for almost a decade, discreetly mentioned that Derek had given him orders about how to cut the grass around the guest house, as if he were the owner. Rosa, the housekeeper, commented embarrassed that Derek had asked her to wash his car during work hours, something that definitely wasn't in her duties. Margaret mentally noted each incident, each small transgression, waiting for the right moment to address the situation. She was a born strategist and knew that hasty confrontations rarely lead to the best results. The last straw was about to fall, and when it fell, it was with a force that Margaret hadn't anticipated. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Margaret had returned earlier from a business meeting that ended sooner than expected. Upon entering through the side door of the property, the one that led directly to the gourmet kitchen she had renovated the previous year, Margaret heard voices coming from the living room. She immediately recognized Derek's voice, but there was another male voice she didn't know. Something in the tone of the conversation, that mixture of arrogance and conspiracy, made Margaret pause before announcing her arrival. It was then that she heard Derek say something that froze her blood. "Man, it's a perfect situation. The old lady has properties all over the region, and she's getting more and more senile. Elizabeth is an only child, so eventually all this will be ours anyway. For now, we just need to put up with the boring Sunday dinners and pretend we care about her stories about the past." The unknown voice laughed, and Margaret heard the sound of glasses toasting. Her heart was pounding so hard she feared they might hear it through the wall. Derek continued, "And the best part of it all is that we live for free in that house in the back. I calculated that she charges at least $3,000 a month when she rents it to other people. $3,000 we're saving every month, brother. It's basically like I'm getting a salary raise without doing absolutely anything." Margaret felt a fury rising within her, that same cold and calculated anger she felt when some arrogant businessman tried to deceive her in a negotiation. But along with the anger, there was pain, a deep pain in realizing that her daughter had married a man who saw her only as a means to an end. She remained motionless, breathing slowly, forcing herself to remain calm while she continued listening. Derek's friend said something about taking advantage of the situation, and Derek responded with a cruel laugh. "Look, Margaret is basically nothing to me. She's just my wife's mother, and she doesn't even do that right. She keeps trying to meddle in everything, giving opinions about our lives. But she doesn't understand that times have changed. That generation of hers thinks hard work is everything, but intelligence is knowing how to take advantage of opportunities. And this house, this lifestyle, this is my opportunity." The word nothing echoed in Margaret's mind like a funeral bell. She, who had built a real estate empire from scratch, who had overcome her husband's premature death and continued expanding her businesses, who had sacrificed countless sleepless nights and weekends to ensure her daughter's future, was nothing to that man who lived under her roof, who ate at her table, who slept in a bed she had bought and paid for. The irony was so absurd it would almost be comical if it weren't so painful. Margaret retreated silently, leaving through the same door she had entered, and drove to her lawyer's office without telling anyone. David Chen had been her lawyer for 15 years, a meticulous man who knew every detail of Margaret's empire and who had always advised her with wisdom and discretion. When Margaret entered his office with that expression he had learned to recognize as a sign of imminent storm, David immediately canceled his next meetings and closed the door. Margaret related everything she had heard, each poisonous word, each cruel laugh, and when she finished, her hands were trembling slightly on the mahogany table. David remained silent for a long moment, processing the information, before asking, "What do you want to do, Margaret?" And Margaret, with that firm voice that had commanded boardrooms and intimidated arrogant investors, responded, "I want to show Derek Mitchell exactly who is nothing in this story." David smiled, that thin smile of someone about to execute a perfect legal strategy, and picked up his pen. The two spent the next 3 hours planning every detail, reviewing documents, checking clauses, and preparing the ground for what would come next. Margaret's plan was simple in its conception, but devastating in its execution. First, she needed to understand the full extent of Derek's financial situation. David discreetly hired a private investigator, something Margaret never imagined she would do regarding a member of her own family, but circumstances demanded extreme measures. Within a week, the investigator returned with a report that confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions. Derek wasn't just living beyond his means, he was actively accumulating debts. His job at the marketing company had ended 3 months ago, something he never mentioned to Elizabeth or Margaret. Since then, he had been applying for positions without success, but maintained the farce of leaving in the morning for work and returning at night, probably spending his days in coffee shops or libraries. The credit card he used to pay his expenses was at its limit, with an accumulated debt of almost $20,000. There were also monthly payments for a sports car he had bought shortly after the wedding, a vehicle completely beyond his real financial possibilities. Margaret read the report twice, feeling a mixture of anger and something she was reluctant to admit as pity. How had Elizabeth not noticed any of this? Or did she know and was hiding it from Margaret out of shame or fear? While Margaret processed this information, she made her second strategic decision. It was time to have a frank conversation with Elizabeth. But not just any conversation, not an explosive confrontation that could push her daughter even further into Derek's arms. Margaret knew the power of emotional manipulation and knew that, if she wasn't careful, Derek could easily turn the situation around and paint Margaret as a controlling mother-in-law trying to destroy her daughter's happy marriage. No, Margaret needed evidence, concrete facts that Elizabeth couldn't deny or rationalize. So Margaret waited, observed, and documented. She began paying more attention to the interactions between Elizabeth and Derek during Sunday dinners. She noticed how Derek always directed the conversation away from any discussion about work or finances. She observed how he touched Elizabeth's arm possessively when she began to talk about her own professional ambitions. She saw how he consistently interrupted her, finishing her sentences or correcting insignificant details of her stories. And most disturbing of all, Margaret noticed how Elizabeth had begun to diminish herself, as if trying to occupy less space in her own life. The vibrant and confident woman Margaret had raised was slowly being transformed into a faded version of herself, and this realization broke Margaret's heart in a way that no financial betrayal could. 2 weeks after the conversation Margaret had overheard, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. It was another Sunday, and Margaret had invited Elizabeth and Derek to dinner, as usual. But this time, Margaret had also invited David Chen and his wife, something she did occasionally to make dinners more interesting. Derek didn't suspect anything. After all, he had dined with David before, and always showed himself excessively friendly with the lawyer, probably calculating that it would be useful to maintain good relations with the man who managed Margaret's legal affairs. The dinner proceeded normally until dessert, when Margaret, with a casual tone she had mentally practiced dozens of times, said, "Derek, I have an interesting proposal for you." Derek raised his eyes from the tiramisu plate, that confident smile stamped on his face. "Of course, Margaret. I'm always open to opportunities." Margaret smiled back, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know that the house where you live I normally rent for $3,000 monthly, correct?" Derek blinked, clearly not expecting the subject to be addressed so directly. "Well, yes, I'm aware of the market value," Margaret continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "It's been almost a year since you've been living there for free. That represents a considerable value that I'm essentially donating. $36,000 to be exact." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Elizabeth looked at her mother with an expression of confusion and growing alarm. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again, like a fish out of water. Margaret didn't give him a chance to formulate a response. "So, I thought it would be fair to formalize this arrangement. David prepared a comodatum contract, which is a free loan of property. Basically, it documents that you're living in the house at no cost, but also establishes some terms and conditions." David, following the script they had rehearsed, opened his briefcase and placed some documents on the table. Derek looked at the papers as if they were poisonous snakes. "What kind of terms and conditions?" His voice had lost all that arrogant confidence. Margaret calmly enumerated. "First, a clause that establishes that the arrangement can be terminated with 30 days' notice from either party. Second, a declaration that no rent payment will be required, but that the property continues to be exclusively mine and confers no property rights to the occupants. Third, a commitment to maintain the property in good condition and allow periodic inspections. And fourth, a clause that establishes that any significant change in the financial or marital circumstances of the occupants must be communicated to the owner." Derek had visibly paled. This seems very formal for a family arrangement." Margaret took a sip of wine, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. "Yes, it's formal, but it happens that I built everything I have by being formal and careful. That's how nothing transforms into something substantial." The word nothing hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Derek froze, and Margaret saw the exact moment when he realized she knew. The blood drained from his face, and he looked quickly at Elizabeth, who was completely lost, looking from one to the other, trying to understand the subtext of the conversation. "Mother, what are you talking about?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small and scared. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on Derek while responding. "I'm talking about valuing what we have and ensuring that everyone understands exactly what the situation is. Derek, are you going to sign this contract?" Derek swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he was cornered. Refusing to sign would be admitting there was something wrong, that he had ulterior motives. But signing would be formally accepting that he had no rights over the property, that he was there by mere generosity from Margaret. "I need to read it carefully first," he murmured. David pushed the documents closer to him. "Of course, take your time, although it's all quite standard. In fact, it's quite generous of Margaret not to include a retroactive rent clause." Derek picked up the papers with trembling hands, and Margaret watched with cold satisfaction as he went through the text, knowing that each word was a reminder of his real position in that house, in that family, in that life he had thought he could simply take for himself. In the days following the dinner, the atmosphere on Margaret's property became tense like a violin string about to break. Derek signed the contract, but only after 3 days of hesitation, and after Elizabeth, confused and increasingly worried, pressured him to simply sign the papers so everything could return to normal. But nothing would return to normal, because Margaret had only just begun. Her next move was even more calculated. She began casually mentioning, during conversations with Elizabeth, that she was thinking about selling some properties to simplify her portfolio. "I'm getting older, dear," she said with a carefully rehearsed sigh, "and managing so many properties is becoming tiring. Maybe it's time to liquidate some assets and live more simply." Elizabeth, always concerned about her mother's well-being, encouraged this idea, without realizing that Margaret was planting seeds of uncertainty. If Derek was counting on a future inheritance, Margaret wanted him to understand that this inheritance might not exist in the way he imagined. Margaret also began mentioning that she was considering establishing a charitable foundation, something she had in fact been thinking about for years, but had never verbalized. "There are so many important causes that need support," she said, observing Derek's reaction from the corner of her eye. "Education for underprivileged youth, housing programs for low-income families. It would be a more significant legacy than simply leaving money accumulating in bank accounts." Derek began to get visibly agitated. His mask of charming son-in-law was slipping, and Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he clenched his fists when he thought no one was looking. It was then that Margaret executed her boldest move. She began spending more time with Elizabeth, alone, without Derek. Mother-daughter lunches, shopping afternoons, spa sessions. Initially, Derek tried to invite himself or suggest he had other plans for Elizabeth, but Margaret was relentless in her kindness, always finding ways to exclude him without seeming deliberately hostile. During these moments alone, Margaret didn't attack Derek directly. She was too intelligent for that. Instead, she asked questions. Innocent, casual questions, but ones that planted seeds of doubt. "How is Derek's work going, dear? He seems stressed lately. Is everything okay? Do you talk about the future, about where you want to be in 5 years?" And slowly, very slowly, Elizabeth began to share her own concerns. How Derek had been distant, how he got irritated when she asked about money, how he seemed to have secrets he didn't share with her. Margaret listened, validated Elizabeth's feelings without pushing her own conclusions, and waited. She waited for the right moment to reveal everything she knew. That moment came on a rainy October afternoon when Elizabeth appeared at Margaret's door with eyes red from crying. Derek had left early that morning, saying he had an important job interview, but Elizabeth had accidentally found collection documents in his car, documents that revealed debts she never knew existed. Confronted, Derek had exploded in anger, accusing Elizabeth of not trusting him, of being controlling like her mother, of not understanding the pressure he was facing. And then he had left, slamming the door so hard that the picture on the wall had fallen. Margaret hugged her daughter as she cried, feeling her own anger grow, but keeping it under fierce control. This was a delicate moment, and Margaret knew she needed to proceed with extreme care. "Dear," she said softly, brushing the hair from Elizabeth's wet face, "I need to tell you something. But first, I need you to know that everything I did was to protect you." And then, with her voice breaking at some moments but remaining firm in others, Margaret told Elizabeth about the conversation she had overheard, about Derek referring to her as nothing, about Derek's plans to simply wait for the inheritance, about everything. Elizabeth listened in shocked silence, her face going through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, pain, humiliation. When Margaret finished, Elizabeth remained silent for a long time, looking at her own hands as if they contained some answer she was desperate to find. The transformation in Elizabeth was gradual but irreversible. She didn't confront Derek immediately, which surprised Margaret. Instead, Elizabeth began to observe, the same way Margaret had done. She began to notice the behavior patterns she had ignored or rationalized before. The way Derek always had an excuse for excessive spending. How he got irritated when she suggested they should be saving to buy their own house. How he never, not once, had suggested they should pay at least a symbolic contribution for the use of the guest house. And the more Elizabeth observed, the more she saw the truth that had been in front of her all along. Derek didn't love her, not truly. He loved what she represented, what she could give him access to. And this realization, more than any financial betrayal, was what finally broke something inside Elizabeth. Margaret watched her daughter go through this painful process of awakening, and her heart ached for her. But she also knew this pain was necessary. It was better for Elizabeth to see the truth now than to continue living a lie for years, decades perhaps, trapped in a marriage where she was just a means to an end. 3 weeks after the revelation, Elizabeth made her decision. She sought a divorce lawyer, not David Chen, who was too close to Margaret, but a female lawyer specializing in family law who had been recommended by a friend. Margaret completely supported the decision, offering to pay the legal fees, an offer that Elizabeth initially refused out of pride, but eventually accepted when she realized she didn't have enough financial resources of her own for a prolonged legal battle. When Derek was served with the divorce papers, his reaction was so predictable that Margaret almost felt sorry for him. First came denial, then anger, then attempts at emotional manipulation. He begged Elizabeth to reconsider, promised changes, swore he would get a better job, that he would pay all the debts. But when none of that worked, when it became clear that Elizabeth had made her final decision, Derek showed his true face. He hired a lawyer and tried to claim he had rights to part of Margaret's properties, arguing that he had been verbally promised that the guest house would be theirs someday. This is where the commoditatum contract that Margaret had insisted on making revealed its true value. David Chen presented the signed document that clearly established that Derek had no rights over the property, that he was there purely as a guest, and that the arrangement could be terminated at any time. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that Derek deserved compensation for the improvements he had made to the house, but when asked to list these improvements, all he could point to were some hooks he had installed in the garage to hang tools. Derek's case quickly fell apart, and with it, any pretense that he had been a legitimate partner in the marriage and the family. Margaret watched it all with grim satisfaction, not because she enjoyed seeing someone suffer, but because justice was being done. The eviction notice came 30 days after the divorce filing, exactly as provided for in the commoditatum contract. Margaret was meticulous in following all correct legal procedures, ensuring that Derek couldn't claim he was being treated unfairly. She even offered to extend the deadline to 60 days, a generosity that Derek rejected with an angry email accusing Margaret of being a controlling witch who had destroyed his marriage. Margaret deleted the email without responding, knowing that any response would only be throwing gasoline on the fire. Instead, she focused on taking care of Elizabeth, who was going through her own emotional demons. The divorce, as necessary as it was still a loss, a mourning for the future Elizabeth had imagined, and that would now never happen. Margaret was there every step of the way, not trying to fix things or diminish the pain, but simply offering constant presence and unconditional love. They took long walks around the property, Elizabeth venting about her feelings of failure and shame, Margaret gently reminding her that recognizing a mistake and correcting it isn't failure, it's courage. Slowly, very slowly, Margaret saw her daughter begin to recover, the colors returning to her face, the light returning to her eyes. The day Derek finally left the guest house was both a relief and an anticlimax. He hired a cheap moving company, and Margaret watched from afar as his belongings were loaded into an old truck. She didn't go there, didn't say goodbye, didn't offer any final words. There was nothing more to say. Derek had revealed exactly who he was, and Margaret had responded by showing him exactly who she was. Not nothing, but a force to be reckoned with. When the truck finally left down the gravel road, leaving the property behind, Margaret allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. That night, she and Elizabeth dined together in the main house, just the two of them, like in the old days before Derek appeared in their lives. They didn't talk about him, didn't waste energy ruminating about the past. Instead, they talked about the future, about Elizabeth's plans to go back to school, about a possible trip they could take together, about renovating the guest house and transforming it into an art studio for Elizabeth. And as they talked, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pure and simple hope. Her daughter was free, was healing, was beginning to rebuild her life on her own terms. But the story didn't end completely that day, because about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Margaret received an unexpected visit. It was Derek's mother, a woman named Patricia, whom Margaret had only met briefly at the wedding. Patricia was nervous, wringing her hands as she asked to speak with Margaret privately. Intrigued, Margaret led her to her private office and offered tea. Patricia accepted with trembling hands, and then, to Margaret's surprise, began to cry. "I need to apologize," Patricia said between sobs, "for what my son did to you and your daughter. I raised Derek to be better than that, but somewhere along the way, he got lost." Margaret listened as Patricia vented about how Derek had always had a sense of entitlement, how she and her ex-husband had perhaps spoiled him too much, protected him too much from the consequences of his actions. Patricia revealed that Derek had tried to move back in with her after the divorce, but she had refused, insisting that he needed to finally learn to stand on his own. "He's living with a friend now," Patricia said, "and for the first time in his life, he's really having to work, really having to be responsible for his own bills. Maybe this is the best thing that could have happened to him." Margaret didn't quite know how to respond to this. Part of her was still furious with Derek, with what he had done, with what he had tried to do. But another part of her, the part that had raised Elizabeth and knew how impossible it is to completely control the choices our children make, felt a pang of empathy for Patricia. In the months that followed, life on Margaret's property found a new rhythm. Elizabeth moved back into the main house temporarily, occupying her old room while she decided what to do next. The guest house was completely renovated, Margaret hiring designers and painters to transform it into something completely new, erasing any trace of Derek's presence. When the renovation was completed, the house gleamed with fresh colors and new furniture, and Margaret gifted it to Elizabeth as a space for her design and art studio. Elizabeth cried when she saw it, not tears of sadness, but of gratitude and a timid joy that was beginning to be reborn within her. The first painting Elizabeth created in her new studio was an abstract portrait of Margaret, all strong lines and vibrant colors, a visual representation of the strength and resilience she had seen in her mother throughout this difficult process. Margaret hung the painting in a prominent place in her office, where she would see it every day and remember that sometimes the truest love is the love that is capable of being hard when necessary, the love that protects even when it means causing temporary pain. The experience with Derek changed Margaret in ways she hadn't anticipated. She became less trusting of first impressions, more cautious about opening her home and her life to other people, but at the same time, she became closer to Elizabeth than ever. 1 year after the divorce, Margaret was in her office reviewing some contracts when Elizabeth entered with an expression Margaret knew well, the expression that said her daughter had made a big decision. "Mother," Elizabeth said, sitting in the chair across from Margaret's desk, "I want to go back to school. I want to get an MBA in property management." Margaret put down her pen, giving her full attention to her daughter. "Why?" she asked, not challengingly, but genuinely curious. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Because I realized during all this that I know almost nothing about your business, about how you built all this. I always simply accepted that you would take care of everything, that I didn't need to worry. But that made me dependent, vulnerable. Derek knew I didn't understand anything about finances or properties, and he used that against me. I never want to be in that position again." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. This was the daughter she had raised, the strong and determined woman who had been hidden under layers of insecurity that Derek had cultivated. "I would pay for school," Margaret began, but Elizabeth interrupted her. "No, I want to pay myself. I'll take out a student loan if necessary. I need to do this for myself." Margaret nodded, understanding. This was Elizabeth's way of reclaiming her independence, her autonomy. "But," Margaret said with a smile, "when you graduate, there's a position waiting for you in my company if you want it. Vice President of Property Development. Competitive market salary, no special treatment." Elizabeth laughed. That genuine laugh Margaret hadn't heard in a long time. Deal. 2 years had passed since that fateful afternoon when Margaret heard Derek call her nothing. In that time, much had changed. Elizabeth completed her MBA with honors, surprising even Margaret with her dedication and talent for business. She did indeed accept the position in Margaret's company and quickly proved her worth, closing some impressive deals and bringing innovative ideas about how to modernize the property portfolio. The guest house, which now served as a studio and sometimes as a space for Elizabeth to host friends, had become a symbol of renewal and new beginnings. Margaret had donated a significant amount to a charitable foundation focused on helping women leave abusive relationships, a cause that became deeply personal to her after Elizabeth's experience. And as for Derek, Margaret occasionally heard news through mutual acquaintances. He had finally gotten a stable job, was slowly paying off his debts, and according to Patricia, who maintained occasional contact with Margaret, he had started therapy and was trying, for the first time, to honestly examine his behavior patterns. Margaret didn't feel particular satisfaction or anger hearing these updates. Derek had become irrelevant to her life, a footnote in a much larger story about resilience and maternal love. On a clear spring morning, Margaret was in the garden of her property, watching the flowers she had planted decades ago bloom once again in their eternal cycle of renewal. Elizabeth was beside her, discussing a new development project she was leading. As they listened to Elizabeth speak with passion and knowledge about zoning and investment returns, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about all the struggles she had faced, all the sleepless nights, all the moments of doubt and fear. She thought about the day she heard Derek call her nothing, and how that word had triggered a series of events that, although painful, had finally led to this moment of peace and purpose. "You know," Margaret said suddenly, interrupting Elizabeth in the middle of a sentence about capitalization rates, "I spent so much time worrying about building something to leave for you. But I realize now that the real legacy isn't the properties or the money. It's this here, this moment, you standing on your own, confident and capable." Elizabeth looked at her mother with bright eyes. "You were always my example, Mother, even when I was too blind to see, even when Derek was trying to convince me that strength was something negative, something that made you difficult to deal with. Margaret laughed softly. Well, I am difficult to deal with. Ask any of my tenants. Elizabeth laughed too, and then became serious. You know, I never really thanked you properly for what you did, for not letting me continue in a marriage that was slowly destroying me. Margaret held Elizabeth's hand, squeezing gently. You don't need to thank me. It's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when they're already adults, even when it means making difficult decisions. They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the tranquility of the garden. Then Elizabeth asked, Did you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't overheard that conversation that day? If Derek had been more careful, more discreet? Margaret considered the question seriously. Yes, I've wondered. And I believe that eventually the truth would have come out anyway. Men like Derek always reveal themselves eventually. He would have made a bigger mistake, or you would have finally seen through his mask. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe you would have lost more years. But I believe you would have found your way back to yourself. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. I believe that too. But still, I'm grateful it happened when it did. Margaret looked at the property she had built with so much work and sacrifice, and then looked at her daughter beside her, the true measure of her success in life. You know, she said, Derek was right about one thing. Elizabeth looked at her surprised. What? Margaret smiled, a smile full of irony and hard-won understanding. He said I was nothing, and in a way he was right. I am nothing to him, not anymore. He has no power over my life, over my family, over my future. He's the one who became nothing in our story. Just a lesson learned, an obstacle overcome. The months continued passing, transforming into years, and the story of Derek Mitchell became something Margaret and Elizabeth rarely discussed. Not out of pain or shame, but simply because there were so many more important and happier things to occupy their minds and conversations. Margaret's company continued to prosper under the co-leadership of mother and daughter, and the dynamic between them was something special. Margaret bringing decades of experience and wisdom, Elizabeth bringing youthful energy and fresh perspectives. They complemented each other perfectly, and the company's employees noticed and commented on the unique synergy between the two. Thomas, the gardener who had witnessed the difficult days during Elizabeth's marriage, said once to Rosa, the housekeeper, "It's beautiful to see, isn't it? How some people grow stronger through trials while others break. Miss Elizabeth is strong like her mother, she just needed a reason to discover it." Rosa agreed, remembering the days when Elizabeth seemed like a shadow of herself, always looking at Derek as if seeking approval before speaking or acting. "That Derek was the best thing that could have left her life," Rosa said with her characteristic wisdom. "Sometimes we need to know the wrong people to appreciate the right ones." Margaret occasionally reflected on the entire situation, especially in quiet moments late at night when she was alone in her office, reviewing numbers or planning new investments. She thought about how life has a funny way of testing us exactly where we're most vulnerable. For Margaret, who had built professional fortresses over decades, her vulnerable point had always been Elizabeth. She would have given everything, sacrificed everything, for her daughter. And Derek, intentionally or not, had found exactly that vulnerability and tried to exploit it. But what Derek didn't count on was that a mother's love, when combined with strategic intelligence and financial resources, is a practically unstoppable force. Margaret hadn't just protected her daughter. She had taught Elizabeth how to protect herself, how to recognize manipulation, how to value her own strength. These were lessons that no MBA could teach, lessons that only life, in all its harshness and complexity, could provide. And now Elizabeth had these lessons, had this armor, and Margaret knew that her daughter would never again be a victim of someone like Derek. This certainty, more than any financial success, more than any property acquired or deal closed, was Margaret's greatest treasure. And so, If you're reading this story and identifying with Margaret, with Elizabeth, or even seeing shadows of a Derek in your own life, leave a comment below sharing your experience. How many of us have faced situations where our kindness was confused with weakness, where our generosity was seen as an opportunity for exploitation? How many mothers have had to make difficult decisions to protect their children from people who didn't have their best intentions in mind? This isn't just Margaret and Derek's story. It's a story about recognizing your own worth, about understanding that being kind doesn't mean being weak, that trusting doesn't mean being naive. It's about knowing when it's time to fight for what's yours, for what you built, for the people you love. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more stories about strength, resilience, and justice. Leave your like if you believe that sometimes true love means making difficult choices, and share with someone who needs to be reminded that they are never, ever nothing, no matter what any person tries to make them believe. Because in the end, the greatest revenge isn't anger or cruel retaliation, but simply living well, thriving, and proving through your actions exactly who you really are.